In this video, I'm going to give you some tips to help you make your mock-ups sound more realistic and more expressive. Now I have a composition here that I just kind of threw together for this video, and I'm going to use this to sort of walk you through some of the things I do to make these samples sound as realistic as possible. Now to start off, I have just a really rough mock-up. This is not going to sound good at all, but just so you know what we're working with, here it is. Alright, so now with a little bit of work, we can make that sound a lot better. Here's what the finished product sounds like, just so you know what we're working towards. Now, everything I've used in this mockup is available as part of East-West Composer Cloud. So if you have that subscription, there's nothing you just heard that you couldn't do with what you have. So let's go ahead and jump into this and take a look at what we can do to make it sound better. So first, let's start with our strings. So I'm going to go ahead and mute everything else. And let's just listen to the strings, and I'll go ahead and pull up the piano roll so you can kind of see what's happening. So the first thing that we obviously need to change is this staccato thing that's happening in the violins. It sounds completely robotic and not expressive at all. Now, the thing that I think will make the biggest difference is changing our articulation. So if we go into Hollywood Strings and look at some of the options that are available to us. So I'm in the first violins folder, and we want short notes for this. You can use either the short tight or the short loose folder. I usually go with loose, but they both work great. So we have a lot of different options here, everything from pizzicato and col legno to staccato, ricochet. I really like what's in this mod combo folder because it allows me to have multiple articulations in a single patch. And the one I like to use is this mod speed one. So I've already got that loaded here. So basically what this does is it changes my articulation based on the mod wheel. So if I have the mod wheel all the way down, I get a really short, tight staccato. And if I put it all the way up, I get a longer kind of marcato and then kind of something else in between. So it's really useful that way. So right now, in this patch, I have my articulation just set to that marcato, which I think it kind of just loads by default. So if I record the mod wheel and put it down all the way, it's going to sound a lot better. Let me do that really quickly on both violin parts. So already sounding a lot better. Let's go ahead and do the same thing with the cello and the bass. So needs a little bit of work still. So the next thing I want to do is adjust my dynamics. If you notice, looking at the velocity, these are all just exactly the same, and it's going to sound unrealistic, unexpressive, and completely uninteresting. So let's go ahead and fix that. You can either do this by performing it in live or adjusting it with the mouse. I usually prefer to try to perform it in, but then I typically end up having to fix it anyway because I'm not that great at performing it. All right, so now I've got my velocities adjusted. I've also done a little more work at the mod wheel so that this note, which is supposed to be up here, this note will be a little bit longer than the other ones in my first violin part. And if we look at the second violin, same thing. We've got accents where we want them, and all of the other notes have a unique dynamic level as well. So let's see what that sounds like. Sounding a lot better already. Now if we jump ahead to this next section, we're going to have some legato notes in the violins. So we have some work to do here. Let's start with this legato violin melody and just isolate it real quick. So it doesn't sound terrible, but we can definitely make it better. First thing I would change is the patch that we're using. So right now I have this on just a long patch or a sustained patch. So when I play one note and then I start playing another, we hear both notes together. Now we want to switch over to a legato patch. And in Hollywood Strings, you can find those down in this legato slur folder. You can use either the top one or the powerful system. I wouldn't use this powerful system unless you actually have a powerful computer. But if you don't, these ones will still sound just fine. So we have a lot of different options here. And if you click on it, then it kind of tells you what you have going on down here. So this one is legato slur, and it's a light patch, so it's not going to be quite as heavy on the computer. And this just means we have a typical legato sound. We have more of a slurred legato sound. And then the niente means that if we pull our CC controller all the way down, whichever one is controlling dynamics, in this case it's going to be CC 11, then it'll go silent. So we can totally fade out or fade in. So find a patch in here that works for you and that sounds good on whatever you've written. Personally, the one I use the most is this one. So it has legato, slur, portamento, and niente. So I've switched all of my legato string tracks over to actual legato patches. So now, when I play one note and then play another, we hear a transition. And if I play soft, we get a slower transition. If I play hard, it's faster. So already that sounds quite a bit better than it would have on just the regular sustained patch. So let's hear what that melody sounds like now that we've switched it over. So one thing about legato patches is that they sometimes struggle a little bit with repeated notes like this. But I'll show you how to deal with that. So the first thing you want to do is take the first note and shorten it a little, so there's more of a gap there. And then you want to use the sustain pedal to bridge that gap. Now, depending on what library you're using, you might not need to do this, but with the Hollywood Strings, I find this method to be pretty effective. And then the next thing that I would do is offset these notes a little bit. So it takes a little bit of time for that transition between notes to happen. And we need to kind of account for that as far as where we place our MIDI notes. So typically, other than my first note, I'll just offset everything a little bit left of the beat. And then when you do that, you need to be careful of your repeated notes and make sure the first note isn't overlapping. So let's try that again. Okay, so that's better. And then I think for this first slide up here, I want that to happen a little bit slower. So I'm going to turn the velocity down on these notes, and we'll get kind of a slur up to those. Okay, yeah, I like that more. And then the next thing we need to do is add in some dynamics. Now, most libraries are going to use the mod wheel for any kind of legato dynamics. For some reason, the Hollywood Strings uses CC11. Works the same way. So if you have a MIDI controller with faders that can be programmed, you might want to program one of them to CC11. Or you can just pencil it in. So one thing I would recommend is listening to the part a few times and thinking about how you as a performer would perform it. How is the phrase going to be shaped? How is each note going to be shaped? Which notes are you going to maybe back off on a little bit? And then once you've kind of got that in your head, make it happen with the MIDI, with your CC controller. So I'm going to go ahead and try performing this now. Now, as you're doing this, you want to make sure that the mod wheel or CC11, whatever you're using, is just constantly moving. As long as that instrument is playing, something needs to be happening to make it sound expressive. So with Hollywood Strings, the mod wheel does actually allow us to control vibrato. Now we're really kind of getting into the nitty gritty here. You can make stuff sound really pretty good without doing this, but I find that it does help to make it a little more expressive. So I'm going to go ahead and add it in. All right, so let's add in the cello and the bass. And we need to give these kind of the same treatment. Everything is just perfectly lined up with the beat, and we have nothing happening with the dynamics. So I'm going to go ahead and add that all in. So now we have dynamics for the cello and the bass, and you can see I've kind of offset them just a little bit so that that transition will happen in time with the beat. Just noticing that these are not quite ending together, so I'm going to fix that. There. Now there's actually a viola part in here that's playing staccato, and I actually have the first cello is playing it as well. So we need to kind of give those the same treatment as the staccato notes that we did earlier. So here it is, just for comparison, here it is before. And now I've gone through and added in dynamics and accents for this part, and here's how it sounds. So next I want to focus in on the brass and see what we can do to make that sound better. So here it is before I've done any work to it. So yeah, not sounding super great. Now again, the first thing I want to do is fix my articulations. And let's take a look at these staccato notes we have going on in the horns here. Now just like we had with the staccato strings, if we look at our brass, we have a bunch of different options for our short notes. And again, the one I like to use is this mod speed patch. It works just like the one for the strings. So I've got that loaded up here. And again, if I have my mod wheel all the way up, I get kind of a longer marcato, and if I pull it down, I get a shorter staccato. So I want these notes that are happening here to be much shorter than they are right now. So okay, so that's better. And then these legato notes here, I want to actually be on a legato patch. At the moment, they are just on a sustain patch, just like what we talked about with the strings. So just so you can hear the difference, here's a sustain patch. And here's the legato patch. Now, like we did with the strings, we're also going to want to offset these a little bit. And probably not the first note quite as much because it doesn't have a transition before it. But then we need to make sure that when we change notes, it does overlap a little. Okay. So let's hear what that sounds like. That's getting a little better. Next thing we need to do is some dynamics. And this is going to be just the same as what we did with the strings. With these staccato notes, I'm going to work with velocity, which we can see right here. All our velocities are just exactly the same. And then with those legato notes, we're going to work with the mod wheel. Because in Hollywood brass, our dynamics for legato notes are actually still controlled by the mod wheel, unlike Hollywood strings for some reason. Okay, so now I've gone through and adjusted my velocities on these short notes, and then on these legato horn notes, I've got kind of a crescendo going on here. I also went ahead and did the same thing with the tuba velocities. So now let's hear what this sounds like all together. Okay, so that's a lot better than it was. So now let's look at this next section. So it sounds a little better than it did before because we already switched over to the legato patches, but our staccato notes definitely need some work. So let's see, right here in bar 8, we've got something going on in the trombones. And right now that's just kind of on that longer articulation. And I have it on one of those mod speed patches. So if I just pull my mod wheel down, I get a shorter staccato. And let's hear what that sounds like. It's a little better, but it's still really quiet. So if we look at our dynamics here, again, just nothing going on here. All right, so now I've kind of fixed the dynamics, and let's see what it sounds like. So that's an improvement, at least for the trombones. Now, we need to work a little more with some of these legato parts. As you can see, everything's just perfectly quantized to the beat. And I expect if I look at our dynamics, there's not much going on. So now, just like we did with the strings, I've gone through and shaped all of these legato phrases in the brass using the mod wheel. And again, the mod wheel information for everything is just constantly moving as long as the instrument is playing. Now, when you're looking at your dynamic lanes, whether it's mod wheel or CC11 or anything else, you want it to kind of resemble a mountain range, because there's a lot of just dynamic fluctuation that goes on when you're performing that you don't even realize that you're doing. And if it's not there, it doesn't sound realistic. So now that I've adjusted that, so I've added the dynamics, and I've also adjusted the timing of these legato transitions, kind of offset everything to the left. Let's hear what this brass all sounds like from the top. So, I mean, we could keep working on it, but it's definitely sounding a lot better than it was. So let's go ahead and add the strings back in and hear how that all sounds together. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do all that same work on my woodwinds now, because pretty much all my woodwinds are doing is doubling other parts. So here's how my woodwinds sound before that. And here's how they sound after doing all of that same work. And I think I want these, let's see, that's an oboe. Oh, that's just a little bit louder than I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that down a little bit. All right, so let's add that back in with the strings and the brass and hear how this is all sounding together now. So we're getting close. Just have the percussion left. And all I've got going on here for percussion is a bass drum and some toms. So there's not going to be a ton of work. So here's just our percussion as it is. So as you can see and probably hear, if we look at this tom part, there's nothing interesting happening with our dynamics. All of our velocities are just exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and change that. So now I've gone through my tom part and added accents and dynamics and everything. So this will sound a lot more interesting now. Alright, so now our bass drum needs a little bit of work as well. So with this bass drum patch, we have a couple of different things we can do. We have just kind of the regular hits, but then we also have rolls. So our hits, for our hits, our dynamics are going to be controlled by velocity, and with the roll, we're going to use the mod wheel so we can have a crescendo. So, as you probably expect, right now, nothing happening with velocity. It's all just the same, and same with the mod wheel. Now I've gone through and adjusted my velocities. There's not a ton of contrast here because each of these notes is kind of at a big, loud moment. And then I've also come in with the mod wheel and put a crescendo in here at the end. So I'm thinking we have just a little bit too much reverb on the drums. So I've turned that down just a little bit. So here that is with a little bit less reverb now. Now, finally, let's put it all back together. And here it is. One last thing that I would add is that I would definitely recommend using reverb as you do this and just adding it in at the beginning. So here's what this all sounds like with no reverb. A lot less interesting. Now the reverb I'm using is East West Spaces 2. Again, comes with your Composer Cloud subscription. And there's lots of different presets in here. I personally like the San Francisco Hall, but you can play around with them and find one that you like. And I find that it's actually really helpful to have the reverb in there as you're working on it, because it is more realistic and sounds more like how it would actually sound in a live performance setting. Now here it is just one more time with the reverb turned back on.